It would be unusual if you didn't feel like you were under attack somewhere in your life. Maybe it's a health issue, a problem in a significant relationship, a mental health challenge, or a financial one. All of those things have emotional, material, and spiritual implications that can leave us feeling beset and besieged. But God has not left us unprotected, and that's where His armor comes in. When we're under attack, we don't have to run, and we don't have to fall. As Paul says to the church in Ephesians 6, stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. For shoes, put on the peace that comes from the good news so you'll be fully prepared. And with all of these, hold up the shield of faith to stop the fiery arrows of the devil. Shields were the first line of defense against the enemy. They were vital because they were big enough to cover you no matter what your opponent tried to use against you. The typical Roman shield was curved, about 2.5 feet wide and 4 feet long, so the soldier was covered from shin to chin. Most were made of 2 pieces of wood, bonded together, then covered with a tough canvas that wrapped around the whole thing. The shields were also edged with iron to make them stronger, and they included an iron boss or bump in the very middle to deflect blows from swords and daggers. Before battle, soldiers would often dunk their shields in water. That's because some armies covered the tips of their javelins and arrows with flaming tar to set the Roman shields on fire, rendering them useless. That's why Paul talks about holding up our spiritual shield to ward off the fiery arrows of the devil. And what exactly is our shield? It's faith. Now, the problem with the word faith is it's one of those churchy words we use all the time, but seldom stop to think about what it actually means. And for many people, it's become so general and generic, it doesn't mean much. So let's start with an examination of exactly what faith is and how it works. In the Bible, faith is interchangeable with 2 other words, belief and trust. Faith in God, belief in God, and trust in God are pretty much the same. But those things are not just intellectual concepts. Faith, belief, and trust imply you're actually going to do something because you have them. That's what we read about in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, which is often called the Hall of Faith, because, like a modern-day Hall of Fame, that passage honors the Bible characters who were famous for their faith or their trust in God. In the chapter's first verse, the writer says, "Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It's the evidence of things we cannot see." Put another way, trust in God shows that what we hope for is real, things like God's involvement in our lives and heaven. And our belief gives us evidence that what we can't yet see is really there. In other words, faith is a trust in God that runs so deep we'll do anything He wants us to. And then the writer illustrates what that looks like with specific examples. He says, "By faith, we understand that the whole universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen." And from there he goes on to talk about faithful believers who took action because they trusted God. By faith, Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave his home and go to a foreign land where the Lord would turn his family into an entire nation in just 4 generations. He left everything that was safe and comfortable and did what God wanted. Verse 8 says, "He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner." By faith, Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the Pharaoh's anger. Verse 27 says, "He kept right on going, because he kept his eyes on the one who's invisible. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned. And by faith, others stayed obedient even though it cost them their lives. In verse 35 we read, "They were tortured, refusing to turn from God. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning, some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword." Now that's real faith. So to sum it up, faith is a constant trust in God, in which we stop relying on our own talents and efforts and put our full confidence in Him, His power, and His promises. That's why Paul begins his discussion on spiritual armor by saying, "Be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power." But our confidence in Him has to inspire real action, because some people believe in God the same way they believe in Antarctica. They assume it's there, but it has absolutely nothing to do with their daily lives. In contrast, our faith in God must be so strong, it causes us to do things we would never even consider were it not for the conviction that God will help us. It's all about confidence and assurance in God and not ourselves. The Bible's Greek word for faith is pistis, which is used 240 times in the New Testament. It means acting on the truth. When we know it's true that God is there, He cares for us, and will work in our lives, we have to act on that by surrendering our own priorities and preconceived ideas. And notice the connection. When talking about putting on all of God's armor, Paul starts with the need in our lives for the belt of truth, the body armor of God's righteousness, and the shoes of peace that come from the gospel. When we truly know truth, righteousness, and peace, we have to act on them, and that's what will protect us. For starters, it'll protect us from our feelings which lie to us all the time. So get this. Faith and feelings are not the same thing. Remember what Hebrews 11 says? Faith is the reality of what we hope for and the evidence of what we cannot see. So when we genuinely trust God, we will see evidence that He's there and at work. And that should shield us from doubt and despair and feelings of unworthiness or inadequacy. Feelings come and go, but faith never leaves us. But also understand that faith is a choice. We choose to hold on to the truth about God no matter what our feelings are telling us. And as I said in an earlier lesson, we can't put on our spiritual armor one day and then take it off the next, depending on our emotions and our circumstances, because our minds and our hearts are always vulnerable to attack. So choose to keep your spiritual protection in place. And while we're on the subject, there are some other things about faith we really need to understand, including the fact that trusting God is not something you can come up with on your own. It's a gift from God. So to have faith, you have to ask for it. In Luke 17, the disciples of Jesus are really disturbed when He calls them to a higher standard than the rest of the world. He tells them, even if someone wrongs you 7 times a day and each time asks forgiveness, you must forgive. Stunned by that, the apostles say to the Lord, "Show us how to increase our faith." And that's a good prayer for us as well. There's a really cool verse in Isaiah 55 in which the prophet quotes God, who says, "The word that goes out of my mouth will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." Now think about that. God is saying that what He wants us to know will never be wasted or useless. His word, and His will have the effect He wants. I heard a really interesting take on that recently. A preacher I know said, God's word is like a deposit, and sometimes it just sits in your heart until you need it. So maybe you listen to one of my messages and you say, well, I didn't get anything out of that, or that didn't apply to me. Whereas perhaps the truth is you have no clue how God is going to use that deposit when you need it most. We need to store up as much truth and trust as we possibly can, so we will be protected when we're under attack. Though faith or trust is a gift from God, it comes in various ways. I like the translation of Romans 10:17, which says, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word about Christ. That means that if we want spiritual protection, we need to stay in an environment that reinforces the truth about God, shows us how to live the righteousness we're called to, and surrounds us with peace. So pray, read your Bible or watch Bible videos, listen to Christian music, find meaningful ways to serve others, limit your exposure to toxic people and material, and spend time with fellow believers who will lift you up and keep you safe. In the Roman army, a favorite formation was called the tortoise, because soldiers used their shields to form a collective shell before advancing upon the enemy. By putting their resources together and moving forward as one, the Romans were able to fend off even the most vicious attacks and gain ground. Even when fighting in close quarters, each soldier offered overlapping protection to the man on his left, because shields were carried in the left hand. That tactic was so successful, it's still seen today in how police use their shields to protect themselves and their comrades. A good illustration is how the South Korean riot police employ a Roman formation during a clash with violent protesters. And so it is with us. We must use our shield of faith to protect not only ourselves, but our brothers and sisters. And when we have each other's back, when we combine our spiritual protection, and when we advance with one heart, one mind, and one purpose, those arrows of the enemy don't stand a chance. But keep in mind that once we get faith from God, it's our responsibility to make it grow. As James 2:17 says, faith, if it isn't accompanied by actions, is dead. So if you're feeling like you're not growing in your trust and confidence in God, get out there and do something. Exercise your faith, develop some spiritual muscle, and take some chances. If God presents you with an opportunity, embrace it, no matter how scary it might seem, because He will be there to get you through. Wouldn't it be fabulous if God could say the same thing about us as Paul said about the Thessalonians? We always thank God for you, brothers and sisters, because your faith is growing more and more, and the love all of you have for each other is increasing. That's what it's all about. God doesn't call us to be comfortable. He calls us to be faithful. But to be faithful, we need to know which fiery darts of the devil we're most vulnerable to. What do they look like in your life? Maybe you doubt the goodness or power of God, or you listen to the big lie that you'll never be what you need to be, or you feel yourself getting sucked into the materialism or mindset of the world around you. Maybe you start to think you're too different, or you don't really fit in the church, or you sense that pride or complacency is getting a foothold in your heart. Just remember that our spiritual adversaries will use every fear, doubt, discouragement, or deep-seated insecurity to take you out. So hold up your shield of faith to hold down your spiritual position. Back in Isaiah, the prophet says to God, "You will keep in perfect peace all who trust in you and keep their thoughts fixed on you." But just know that if your thoughts are not fixed on Him, they will be fixed on your fears and anxieties, your depression, or your distractions. Hold up your shield of faith, and then, as the prophet goes on to say, no weapon turned against you will succeed. Not only will we be able to stand our ground, but our reliance on God can also help us advance on enemy territory and take back some of the things stolen from our lives. Things like our sense of value, our confidence in God, and our hope for a life better than the one here. In Hebrews 11, that hope of heaven is closely related to faith or trust in God. Speaking about the faithful, the writer says, "They knew they were foreigners and nomads here on earth, and were looking forward to a better place, a heavenly homeland. That's why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them." All those people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. But that is still to come for all of us. Until then, God's promise is backed up by God's protection, and the shield of faith is a crucial part of that. So hold your shield high, and you'll never be brought low. See you next time.